Kerk L. Phillips is Associate Professor of Economics at Brigham Young University, where he's worked since 1992. He has taught at the University of Michigan, Nanjing University, and Korea University. He has worked for 6 months at the Joint Economic Committee of Congress in 2004. His research interests include computational macroeconomics, international finance, exchange rate behavior, economic growth, and Asian economics. Professor Phillips has written articles published in a variety of journals, including the Journal of Economic Studies, Journal of Asian Economics, and International Review of Economics and Finance. He received a Bachelor of Science in Economics from BYU and an MA and PhD in Economics from the University of Rochester. I should also mention that his most distinguished title, our former International Relations Coordinator. It's always great to welcome Professor Phillips back. About a semester ago, when Thomas Piketty's book came out, I first heard about it through our friend and colleague, Professor Scott Sprenger, former Associate Dean in Humanities, who I think spent a weekend reading the book, the first person I knew who read it, and maybe the only. But the discussion really hit sort of the national, media and became sort of a flashpoint for issues of economic inequality. So since then, we've been looking for someone who could address this topic and this important book. At the end of the semester, I thought maybe we'd missed our window, but then Bill Gates had the good fortune to list Piketty's book on his list of top books to read for the year, so it came back again. Today, we're very pleased to welcome Professor Kerk Phillips. The title of his presentation is A Discussion of Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. Please join me in welcoming Kerk Phillips.
Well, it's good to be back in the Kennedy Center, giving a talk. As Corey mentioned, this paper is looking at Piketty's book. I don't really want to go through a book report here, however. So what I'm going to be doing, sort of in an outline here, I think I pushed the button, and, is I'm going to walk through the data, or not all the data. Piketty's book's really big. I'm going to walk through some important pieces of data that Piketty presents. I'm going to give his interpretation. And then what I want to talk about is the things that he lays down in terms of policy proposals and the things he lays down in terms of forecasts of where economies are headed as a result of the inequality data he looks at. And I'm going to do that in the context of a couple of models that I and my colleagues in the economics department have been working on. And I hope these are going to be interesting. They're models, so I try to start off with a humorous anecdote when I give a talk, and so I'm going to tell you a story about models. This is a story that my grandfather told me more than once, actually. He kind of like me, when he got on in years, he kept telling the same jokes over and over. But this was about a man who every morning he would try to help his wife do the buttons up on the back of her dress, and every morning he would fail miserably and he'd get them out of order. And one morning, by sheer chance, he just managed to do this right, and his wife said, "Oh, honey, I'm so proud of you. You're a model husband." So he went to work, and he was really excited, and he was cheerful, and one of his coworkers said, what's up with you? Why are you so happy? He said, "Oh, my wife told me I'm a model husband." And the coworker said, "Well, do you know what that word means?" He says, "I think I know what that word means, and I'll go check." So he went and looked it up in the dictionary, and there under the word model, he said, he saw the definition, which said a model is a small imitation of the real thing. And that's kind of what we're going to be doing here when we talk about our models. They're small imitations of the real thing. The nice thing about small imitations is that they're tractable. You can work with them, whereas trying to work with reality and all of its warts and whatnot is difficult. So first off, to talk about Piketty's book, Piketty has a very large, very thick book, which it's like running a marathon. A lot of people just don't finish it. But it's a very rich description of the inequality that we observe across countries for a fairly long period of time. He's got especially good data for the U.S., Great Britain, and France, Piketty being French, he got really good access to French data. So I'll walk through that really briefly. He has some forecasts that he makes about what's inequality likely to look in the future based upon these. These are very loose forecasts in the sense that there's not really any formal theory behind these forecasts. And then he has some policy prescriptions that he lays out in the book. One of these being, the one that caught the most press attention being his proposal for a global wealth tax. And one of the things that comes across here in the book, particularly in the introduction, which is what most people have read and then quit, is Piketty has a real antipathy towards formal mathematical modeling. And that, I think, is one of the shortcomings of the book. The book is great in terms of presenting data, but in terms of how you want to interpret this data, the interpretation is a little bit difficult to do because he just doesn't want to throw these things, a formal model at the data. All right, so here's some facts that Piketty points out in the book. Income inequality has fallen very dramatically in most countries since the early 1900s. In a lot of countries, particularly in the US and the UK, Canada, income inequality has risen since this drop. So there's like a dip in inequality, and there's a recovery from this. And one of the things that he also points out is that the share of capital in total income has been rising recently. And this is going to be important for some stuff we talk about later. So here's some data. These are, the nice thing about Piketty's book is if you want to go look at the charts and the data, it's all available on a website. You can just go pull up the data, you can pull up the spreadsheets, and you can, if you're a data nerd, you can just browse to your heart's content. So here's one of the charts he shows. This is looking at income inequality for the United States starting in 1910. The plots that he's showing here are the share of the top 10% of income earners, right? So if everything was equally distributed, we just have a straight line there at 10%. But what you can see is up until, say, World War II, the beginning of World War II, there's an upward trend in the 40 to 45% range. World War II hits, and we get this huge drop in inequality as measured by the share that the top 10% gather in terms of GDP. And that lasts through the 70s, and then starting in the 80s, we got this upward trend again, such that if you look at this number now, we're back up to the levels we had during the 1920s in terms of the percent that the top income earners earn. And there are two things here. There's and you can see they're very close. One of these is saying, well, suppose we exclude the capital gains. Does that make a big difference? And the answer is no. Those two charts look exactly the same. If you decompose this further, you can get data, so that's the top 10%. Who are the top 10%? We can look at the top 1% here. And somewhere here there's a button where I get a... Top on the disk. Oh, there we go. Yeah, you got to be smart. So if you look at this dashed solid, not dashed solid, that makes a lot of sense. This triangle one here, the darkest one, this is the share of the top 1% out of the... and then we've got the next 4% below that and the bottom 5% within the top 10. And you can see a lot of the dynamics are being driven here by what's going on with that top 1%. Though clearly there's a bit of an echo early on here, at least with the other categories within the top 10. But the recent movements that we've been observing in the United States are being driven by the top 1%. If you, is that what I want to look at? Yes, that is. So if you look at this across other countries, there we go. He breaks his data down several different ways. One set of countries, he says, well, let's look at Anglo-Saxon countries. And so that's the US, the UK, Canada, and Australia. I guess these are countries where we speak English. And for whatever reason, English-speaking countries just look different in terms of inequality. So you can see the US, Canada, the UK, Australia follow very similar patterns. The absolute amounts are slightly different, but the time series pattern over time looks pretty similar. So we get this big drop that occurs somewhere around World War II, and starting in the 1980s, there's this trend going upward again. Okay. Pushing the wrong button. There we go. Okay. If you look at continental Europe, and he's got continental Europe is defined as France, Germany, Sweden, and then we throw in Japan. What you observe is the drop, but there's no subsequent recovery. Right? So inequality falls, and it tends to stay low. The same thing is true for countries in southern Europe. So if you look at France, Denmark, Italy, Spain, so I guess this is northern and southern Europe, you get a similar pattern. I thought I had one more, but I guess that's it. Okay, so Piketty is going to look at this data, and he's going to say, okay, well, what does this tell us? How am I going to, based upon this data, be able to predict what's going to happen in the future? Now, Piketty is going to do this with a model, but as I mentioned, he's not really keen on formal mathematical modeling. That's fine. I mean, one can still build a model, a small imitation of the real economy, without modeling it mathematically. And so he does have a model in mind, but it's the reasoning that's done is sort of intuitive reasoning, and it's not done mathematically. Okay? So he argues a couple of things based upon this data. First one is that a key thing for determining whether inequality is going to continue to grow over time is whether the interest rate that we observe in the economy is greater than the general growth rate in the economy over time. And he argues that if the interest rate is greater than the growth rate, we end up with the wealthy owning a much larger percent of GDP than we would otherwise. And the reasoning is pretty straightforward. If you think about wealthy people as having most of their income that they earn come from the rents or the return that they get from owning property, that stock of property is going to be growing however fast the interest rate grows, minus some fraction that they subtract away from that to use for consumption. So if you thought about wealthy people as living in big dynasties over time, they're not withdrawing much of their wealth in the form of consumption, and so the return, the size of their portfolio, the size of their wealth is going to be going up as fast as the interest rate does. Poor people, the argument would be, well, poor people don't have a whole lot of capital income. They're primarily going to be having labor income. Labor income will be growing at whatever rate the rest of the economy grows at. So the economy is going to be growing at some rate G. It's determined by whatever forces drive economic growth. The marginal product of labor is going to be growing at the same rate, and the wage rate is going to be roughly equal to how productive the workers are if it's a competitive labor market. And so if R is greater than G, what we're going to end up with in the end is concentration of wealth in the hands of people that have property, and everybody else is going to own very little property, certainly as a percent of the total. Okay? He talks a little bit here as well as about there are convergent forces and divergent forces. The divergent forces are the ones that we just mentioned. But there are convergent forces. So you might say, look, there's diffusion of knowledge. There's investment in training and skills that goes on. So those things are going to tend people to have more equal distribution of income. So it might be that wealthy people, the reason that they're wealthy is just because they're really talented. And so they're earning really high incomes to start off with. But if we have knowledge diffusion, we have investment in skills, we can educate people at the other end of the income spectrum, and they're going to become just as productive, and that's a force towards convergence, which is away from inequality. And Piketty's argument is that the divergent forces are the ones that are really powerful, and the convergent forces aren't big enough to offset them. Okay? And I think this is basically just what I said about why it is that R has to be greater than G. Okay? So Piketty in the book talks about several ways it might be that we get divergence in wealth. One possibility is, as we just said, look, you know, it might be the reason that people are earning high incomes is just because they're really productive, right? So Michael Jordan made a lot of money because he was just a really good basketball player. He earned higher wages than other basketball players did because he just had a lot more talent. So that's one possibility. It's just differences in earnings abilities. Another possibility is, though, that we might have differences in the rate at which individuals save. So it might be that wealthy families or wealthy dynasties say, look, I'm going to save 50% of the income that I earn. If you're less wealthy, if you're living at the poverty level or below, you might very well say, look, I can't afford to save that much. I have to, you know, my goal is to stay alive. I'm going to spend all my money on consuming food, and so my savings rate's going to be really low, and therefore wealthy people are going to accumulate lots of wealth, and poor people aren't going to be able to. Another possibility is you might actually have differences in rates of return. It might not be that the savings rates are all that different, but it could be that the reason that people are wealthy is just that they're really good at investing. Right? So I've got people who just understand how to invest their assets. They're going to put their money in the stock market, or they're going to go buy property. They're going to make wise purchases, and their wealth is going to rise a lot faster than people who just aren't really that good at investing. Another way to interpret this might be, look, you know, the deck is just stacked against some people. So if you really want to think about this as, you know, some sort of wealth conspiracy, it might be, look, people who are wealthy run the political system. They set it up so that they're the ones that are going to earn all the returns on capital. Anybody else tries to, they're just going to end up earning lower returns. They're not the insiders. They're not going to make those returns. Okay. And what we want to do, or what I want to do in this presentation, is talk about each one of those and what those imply. Piketty not only talks about those, but then he talks about a lot of policy proposals, but the two major ones here are, first of all, an increase in the progressivity of the income tax. I mean, income taxes in most countries are already progressive. Piketty's proposal is, well, we just need to make them more progressive, put a higher burden on the wealthy and a lower burden on the poor. But he also talks about a wealth tax as another possibility. And so when we look at policy proposals here, we'll want to look at least at both of those. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the work we've done since the Piketty book came out. I've got two papers I want to talk about. The first one is a very simple but highly stylized model that I worked on with Richard Evans and Scott Conde in the economics department. And the second one is a much more complicated computational model. It's been calibrated, hopefully pretty closely to match the US. And that one I have a variety of co-authors on. Richard Evans is here at BYU. Evan Magnuson and Isaac Swift are a couple of our students, and then Jason DeBacher and Shanti Ramnath are economists at Middle Tennessee State University, and I think Shanti's at Treasury Department, working with IRS data. So that's a very different model. We have to have a pretty decent computer to run, and we have to run it for a long time, whereas the simple model that I'm going to look at is one we can sort of write down with a pencil and paper, and if we want to simulate it, you know, we might have to use Microsoft Excel or something like that. So they're very different models. What we're trying to do with these is ask a couple of questions. The first one is, under what conditions are we going to end up with this extreme concentration of wealth where it's possible we're going to end up with the top 1% of the wealth in the economy, or the wealthy in the economy, how do we end up with those guys controlling 100% or close to 100% of the wealth? And presumably that's something we would like to avoid. Okay? So first one is sort of a theoretical question. You know, under what conditions is that likely to occur? How likely are those conditions to actually occur in the real world? If they're likely to occur, then we should be worried about this. If they're not that likely to occur, then maybe it's not a problem that we should be worried all that much about. Okay? And then the other two questions we want to look at are, well, you know, what's the effect of these two different tax proposals that Piketty's put forth? Okay, so first I want to go through this simple little model. I don't want to give you all the details of the model. This is an economics talk. It's boring enough as it is anyway. So I'll present, I think it was Alfred Marshall who said, if you want to do economics, the way you do economics is you write down your assumptions in plain English, translate them into mathematics, do a whole bunch of mathematics, and get some results, and then you translate those results back into English, and then you take all the mathematics and you throw it away and never talk about it again, because nobody wants to see that. So let me describe the model. The model is a very simple model, and what we're trying to capture with this model is some of what Piketty talks about in the book. That is, we want to think about households as being infinitely lived dynasties. Okay, now clearly that's not what every household looks like, but the way that we're going to pass wealth on in this really simple little model is we're going to think about a household being run by the head of the household for his lifetime, or at least his adult lifetime, until he dies. He or she dies, I suppose. And then right before the head of the household dies, they pass the wealth on to their children, and those children then are going to earn some wage income. They're going to have the returns on the bequest that their parent gave them, and they're going to do the same thing. We just do this over and over and over again. Okay? Now, to keep things simple, we're just going to let everybody have one kid. The idea simply being, look, we've got a current generation that passes its wealth on to the next generation. Okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to split our types of individuals, or our types of dynasties, into two categories. One that's going to correspond to the top 1%, and then the other one, which is the rest of us. We are the 99%, the people that are left over. Okay? And we're going to look at the behavior in terms of the assets acquired by these individuals when we look at differences in their savings or bequest rates. In this model, the only way that people save over time is by leaving a big block of funds to their heirs. So savings and bequests are the same thing in this model. They're also going to have some labor income, and that could vary by type. So it might be that wealthy people are, again, more productive. And we'll look at returns and savings and just sort of see, what do those things do? Okay. We're going to get some theoretical results out of this that I think are interesting. Of course, I think they're interesting. Otherwise, we wouldn't have written the paper, I guess. There are three conditions that must be met in order to end up in this world where the wealthy control all of the assets in the economy. So the 1% owns all the wealth. Okay? First thing is, capital and labor have to be substitutes in production, and that's a weird assumption. It doesn't make a whole lot of intuitive sense, but it's nonetheless true. If I have capital and labor being complements, that is, suppose when I give you a unit of capital as a worker, I increase your labor productivity. That would mean labor and capital are complements. In that world, I never have to worry about wealth concentrations occurring. Okay? There's a bound on how much wealth can be accumulated, and that's going to depend in part on how substitutable or how complementary these goods are. If I have substitutes, that would be the case where you give the firm an extra unit of capital, and what the firm says is, well, now that I got this capital, I don't need the worker anymore. So this is like a world where we have robots or something, and then we'd have substitutes. Okay? Another thing that's also has to be true is you have to have technical progress being embedded in the form of human capital, or at least primarily in the form of human capital. That is, when we get better technology, the technology that we get has to accrue primarily to workers. And it makes workers more productive without affecting necessarily the productivity of capital directly. Okay? And then the last one that has to be true is the rich have to end up saving more than everybody else in the economy. If I violate any one of those three assumptions in this really simple model, I'm never going to get a concentrated amount of wealth. I could still get concentrated in the sense of having all the wealth owned by the top 1%. I could have them own a really large percent. They could own 80% or 90% or 94%, but they're not going to ever own 100% if I violate any one of those assumptions. Okay, which is useful to know. One of the things that we're able to get from this is that of these two channels that Piketty talked about, he talked about there might be differences in savings, there might be differences in their earnings abilities, or it might be that, you know, we've got these insider-outsiders, and so some people just earn really high rates of return when they save. It turns out that those last two can't do it by themselves. They're insufficient. That is, even if I have the wealthy earning really, really high rates of return, you know, 20% a year, and the poor are earning minus 5% a year on their investments, even in a world like that, I'm still not going to get 100% wealth concentration. Okay? And it's also true for earnings abilities. If I have really highly productive workers and very low productive workers, I'm not going to get concentration in the hands of the wealthy. So that's useful to know to the extent that I think this really simple model might correspond somewhat to the real world. It means that in a lot of cases, we don't have to worry about extreme concentration of wealth. Okay. There we go. Okay. We then run on this model a series of simulations where we impose three different types of taxes. And again, we're trying to replicate what Piketty's doing. So we actually set up a model here where we go back and we say, let's make sure that all three those things are true. Okay? If we set up a model like that, then what we're going to observe in the long run is that the wealthy own 100% of all the assets in the economy. Okay, now given we've set up a model where all those three things are true, now let's go see what the effects are of imposing various types of taxes. So we're going to look at a flat wealth tax, and what we're going to see, the flat wealth tax doesn't eliminate the concentration. It delays it, but it doesn't eliminate it. A graduated wealth tax will eliminate it, and a flat income tax will also eliminate it, but the flat income tax is a little bit more efficient at doing it, or effective at doing it, okay? So here's some simulations, okay? So let me talk about what's going on in these simulations. We're starting off with an equal distribution of wealth across all individuals, and we're saying, okay, let the top 1% have a higher savings rate than everybody else, okay? What does the economy do over time? And you can see that solid black line is our baseline case. And the way we've set this up, they end up with 100% of the wealth. Okay? If I start imposing a flat wealth tax of 10%, 25%, 50%, all I end up doing is delaying how long it takes until we reach full concentration. And the wealthy are still going to end up with 100% of the wealth. So the wealth tax in and of itself is not, at least in the simple model, is not going to cut it. Okay? If I have a graduated wealth tax, however, I still get that same baseline case at the top, but as you can see, as I increase the wealth taxes, what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to have, in the limit, as we go further and further out in time, the percent that the wealthy own is going to be capped based upon how high the wealth tax is. Okay? So suppose I say, look, I don't want the top 1% to own any more than 30% of all the assets in the economy. Then I would want to impose a wealth tax of a little bit more than 75%. Now, I've got to be a little bit careful about this. This is a wealth tax that gets imposed once per generation. right? So it's a bequest tax. So I want to take away 75, 80% of people's inheritance that they pass on to their children, assuming that that's the only way that we pass wealth on, okay? If I do this with an income tax and I say I want to have that top thing, that thing be capped out at 30%, then I can impose a flat income tax on the order of, if I'm trying to cap it out at 30, somewhere between 50 and 75, so probably something like 60% would get me the same result. And so from that we say, well, that just seems to indicate that an income tax is a more effective or efficient way of getting the desired result than resorting to a wealth tax. All right, let me talk about the other model real quick. This is a much more complex model. This is a large-scale model that we've put together with the Open Source Policy Center at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. We've got a large number of very different-looking households in this economy. These households are each living for a lifespan that could be at the maximum. They could live to age 100. And then we've calibrated the demographics and we've calibrated the tax codes such that we mimic what we observe in the US. So this is not a highly stylized model. This is a model that is designed. The main purpose of this model is to say, suppose I change the tax code, what's that going to do to the revenue that the government will generate? Okay, so it's a model that we at least hope is pretty realistic, at least in terms of looking at the US. It's been calibrated to the US. There are two types of inequality we can look at in this case. The first one is going to be differences that occur over your life cycle. And then we're going to have differences that are due to your earnings ability and your savings that are unrelated to your life cycle. And I'm going to argue that we're mostly, in terms of policy, concerned with the second one of these. So it may very well be that we have lots of differences in income across the life cycle, right? So I'm earning right now a lot more than my son is earning, who just barely graduated. Should I really be concerned about that? Should I be taxing myself and transferring it to my son? He probably thinks so. I do a little bit of that voluntarily anyway. But do I want to put a public policy in place that sort of takes away from people who are wealthy in old ages and makes them wealthy in their young ages? In some sense, through their savings behavior, they can undo that, right? They may very well decide, look, even though I've got a high amount of income today, I might decide I'm just going to consume less, put it in savings, and I'm willing to, I'll consume more when I'm old. So I'm probably not too much concerned about that. I am probably, however, more interested in differences that occur just because of fundamental abilities. All right, so I'm earning a lot less money than Greg Mankiw is, who's teaching at Harvard. Should we be concerned about that? Should we tax Mankiw and give to me? Yeah, that's important, right? But the life cycle stuff is not, or not as important. Okay, so what we have here is a case where we introduce a more progressive income tax. We start off with this dashed line for the baseline, and what we're looking at here is a measure of inequality that's referred to as the Gini coefficient. It's not the share that the top 1% or top 10% own, but the bigger that number is, the more unequal the distribution is. And you can see with the dashed line there, that's the baseline case. This is the total inequality in the economy. And it's moving around, and the reason it's moving around is basically because of demographics within the US. So we've got baby boomers moving through, and then we've got the generation that was born after the baby boomers, the boomlet, and that's going to cause life cycle variation in the amount of inequality that we observe in the economy. Okay? So that's the dashed line. If we then implement an increase in the progressivity of the tax system, we end up with the dashed line. And you say, well, that looks pretty good. We're decreasing the total amount of inequality as a result of having done this. But notice what's happening here is that if I look at the inequality that occurs over the life cycle, so I say, let's just put everybody together by their age. Sum up all their assets by age. And I say, okay, how unequal is the distribution across ages? This tax doesn't do hardly anything. Has very little effect on that. And I'd say, well, that's not too bad because I don't really care about life cycle inequality. If I look at the decrease in stuff that's not related to the life cycle, I get a really big jump there. Of course, part of that's due to the scaling of the graph, so it looks really big. But I do get a drop in the type of inequality that I'm probably interested in, which is the equality across earnings ability types. Okay? This is where I take everybody and say, look, it doesn't matter how old you are. Let me just figure out how much money you've earned. What does that income equality look like? Okay? If we were to move, so let me show what's going on here in this case. So this is a difficult graph to read, but basically I've got ages along one axis and I've got ability along the other axis, and the height above or below 0 shows me how much my consumption changes as a function of how old I am and whether I'm a low ability person, which should be towards the front, or whether I'm a high ability person, which would put me towards the back. And what happens here is that when the demographics all die out and I end up in a steady state, what I'm going to be observing here is that this is going to be resulting in an increase in consumption by people towards the front, people who are not so wealthy, and a decrease in consumption to people towards the back. And these effects are larger the older the people get. Right? So it doesn't have any effect at all on people who've just barely entered the workforce because they have very little income to start off with. But it does have an effect for later ages. Okay? This is the effect in the hours worked. Part of what's going to be going on here is poor people are not going to have to work as much as a result of this tax, and they're going to take more leisure time. And rich people end up working more as a result of the tax. Okay? Suppose you think about a wealth tax. This is a progressive wealth tax. And we think about, okay, well, what happens here from the baseline if we impose the wealth tax instead of the income, increasing the progressivity of the income tax? We go from the dashed line to the solid line. And again, there's a decrease. Doesn't look as big, but it is a decrease. But again, we can decompose this. So this is what happens to the inequality over the life cycle across ages. And what's happening here when we impose this wealth tax is we actually end up increasing the inequality that we observe over the life cycle. So we're going to end up with young people being poorer and...
It's a decrease.
You're right.
The next one's the increase.
The next one's the increase. Got it back. This is what we have to change the dashed line. So yeah, we got it going the other way. So we got a decrease in life cycle inequality. But again, I don't really care that much about life cycle inequality, right? So I'm going to have this, the life cycle inequality is going to be changed. Well, I guess what this would be saying is young people are going to be a little bit more wealthy and old people are going to be a little bit poorer. But in the long run, over the course of your lifetime, there may be not that much change in how much you consume over your lifetime. Okay, if I think about this one here, however, now when I go from the baseline, this is the income inequality that's not related to your life cycle. Really, that's a small change, probably not significantly different from 0, but the best estimate is it goes up a little bit. So it's kind of doing exactly the opposite of what we'd want it to do. And so what I pull out of this, of course, this is what you might expect me to pull out of this, I'm somewhat biased, is look, I got 2 different models, and they tell me pretty much the same thing. That is, if my choice is between imposing a wealth tax or imposing an income tax, the wealth tax is not as effective, it doesn't do the right things, whereas the income tax is more likely to push me in the direction I want to go in terms of increasing the amount of equality in the economy particularly the type of equality I'm most concerned with, which is equality across people's earnings ability types. Okay. You can see this is just showing you what happens with consumption. And basically, 0 is at the very top. So everybody ends up with lower level of consumption when I impose a wealth tax. It doesn't matter really how wealthy you are. And the older you are, the less you're going to consume as a result of having the wealth tax. So everybody ends up worse off, basically, as a result of imposing the wealth tax. All right, so what are the conclusions? I didn't put the conclusions in. The conclusions are sort of what I just mentioned. In order to have an unbounded income inequality where the wealthy are going to own 100% of the economy, I'm going to have things going on in the economy that are probably pretty unrealistic. So what that tells me is, at least theoretically, income equality probably is bounded, but it doesn't tell me what the bound is, right? And if I tell you, look, income equality is bounded, it's not going to go to 100% being owned by the top 1% of the economy. It's going to go to 99.999% owned by the top 1%. You might very well say, I don't care about the difference, right? So the theoretical result may not be all that interesting. If I could tell you, look, it's bounded such that the bound is 20% of the wealth is the maximum I could ever get that would be owned by the top 1%, then that might be something that you would be interested in, okay? The other thing that we've got then is that if I'm going to try and address this problem and say, look, income inequality is something that we as policymakers want to change, then the most effective way to do that is not to impose a wealth tax, which is politically probably not that feasible anyway. It would be much more efficient and effective if we were to attack this problem by simply increasing the progressivity of the income tax. So I'll quit there.
So we do have a few minutes before the class break. If you'd like to ask a question, please, we invite you to form a queue here. Tell us your name, what you're studying, and we'll go for a few more minutes. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Tim Reiser. I'm doing applied math and economics, and I was wondering if you could, in the spirit of Marshall's admonition, kind of expound a little bit more on that conclusion, what we can back out of the model as to why a wealth tax is less efficient and less effective. What's the intuition that you pull out of the model? Thank you.
Wealth taxes are really distortionary. I think that's the bottom line that's going on, is if I tax your wealth and I tax it at a fairly high rate, you have no incentive to save. And savings is what builds up an economy's capital stock. And when I build up a capital stock, I mean, the welfare effects are going to be, look, if I start taxing wealth, we're going to have less capital, workers are going to be less productive, everybody's worse off. That's the short answer. If you want the mathematical answer, then I can give you a copy of the paper and we can go through it line by line, precept upon precept.
Hi. Connor Mills. I'm studying supply chain management. I was just curious, do you think the way that the U.S. is doing its tax system right now is like the ideal way or the most efficient way?
Probably not.
No.
I think one of the things we need in the U.S. is some tax reform. Right. So I mean, the way the tax system is set up, all sorts of things get loopholed out. In terms of inequality, if we were just thinking about how much inequality do we want to have, is the income tax system set up in such a way that we get the level of inequality we want? That's a tough question, right? Because one of the things that you do when you get more equality, forced equality, is you're also going to get lower standards of living, right? So you have to decide, you know, what trade-off am I willing to live with? And different people will answer that different ways, right? So I guess the answer is I don't know. It's the short answer.
Hi, I'm Julia Parker. I'm a political science minor. I hope you don't mind just an opinion question.
Okay.
Understanding Piketty's policy proposals as being a way to redistribute wealth, do you believe that that is constitutional in the United States?
Probably. I mean, we do this now, and presumably the laws that we have on the books now are constitutional. So we have all sorts of, the progressivity of the income tax is designed, right, to make sure that wealthy people pay more as a percentage of their income than poor do, at least loopholes aside, right? So yeah, it probably is constitutional. I mean, constitutional and desirable are probably two different questions. And again, it goes back to this issue of how do I want to trade off equality versus standard of living. So.
Thank you.
My name is Travis Dolney. I'm a geography major here. My question, Dr. Phillips, in your opinion, is there an optimal level of wealth concentration by the 1%, for example? And if so, how would you go about deriving that sort of a conclusion?
Well, there's a really simple answer to that, which is the optimal concentration would be where Phillips owns everything, and I would be a benevolent dictator. That's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Is there an optimal? Again, you have to decide what is it that we're trying to maximize, right? If my goal is all I want to do is maximize the average standard of living within an economy, then it might very well be the way I maximize the average is I just say let Bill Gates own everything. Everybody else is going to have zero, but boy, what he has is going to be really big, and when I divide that by the number of people, the average is really high. If my goal is, no, that's too extreme, I want everybody to have perfect equal distribution, then we could all be equally starving and have no assets, and we would get no income inequality, but that's probably not a result we want either. So to figure out what the optimal is, you have to say, okay, how do I weight those two things, right? And if I'm Bill Gates already, I probably don't care about, well, he does because he recommended the book for his reading list. So maybe he cares about income equality. But if I'm Warren Buffett, maybe I don't, right?
I'm Dan Egbert, economics major. So when I think about the wealthiest people in the world, for example, Warren Buffett, Mark Zuckerberg, the vast majority of their wealth, like probably more than 99% of their wealth, is accumulated through asset appreciation, for example, Berkshire Hathaway or Facebook, and very little of that is income. So how do you, when you say income, how do you tax that, I guess, their appreciation?
Right, which is one of the reasons that Piketty's in favor of this wealth tax, right? Which is, I mean, when you tax income, you're indirectly taxing wealth, right? So if I get income, I'm going to get labor income, but I'm also going to get the rents that I earn, the interest rate returns on my portfolio that I might happen to hold, right? And so when I tax income, I'm taxing the rents or the rental return on that stock of wealth. So it's an indirect taxation of my wealth. And Piketty would say, no, the fundamental problem is that wealth is so big that the only way to really tackle it is to tax the wealth directly, right? I don't know if that answered the question, but.
Any final questions? If not, please join me in thanking Professor Phillips.